Good evening, everyone. So very good to have you all here with us tonight as we continue in our study of 1 Timothy chapter 3. Just for a second, a little bit of our housekeeping. This Wednesday, our class, one more time, isn't going to be broadcast live. The typical teacher, myself, isn't going to be here this Wednesday night, so we have somebody else filling in, and the class will be at the building, but we won't be able to broadcast it from there at that time. So it'll be next Sunday before we get back to an online study. But we'd like to invite you in this study to get your Bible out, and let's go together to the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we've been talking about deacons, those marvelous servants of the church, have such important jobs for us to consider, and we've been talking about how they carry such weight in the things that they do and why it is that they are so vital to the church. You might remember that when we described them before, we were saying that the deacons are kind of the peacemakers of the church by ensuring that everything is going smoothly, nobody's being neglected, and I kind of point to Acts chapter 6 for this story. We can see how it is that they're such a vital part of the integrity of a local church. They are the fulfillers of the promises of God in the sense that they're making sure that the church is, taking care of those who have needs. Just can't say enough about how vital and important that work has been. And as we've been talking about these things, we've been looking at those qualifications that we find there in 1 Timothy chapter 3. We talked about their being reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding fast the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. We talked about them being tested. And we jumped over to verses 12 and 13. And we were in verse 12 last time we were together, and we were talking about how the Word of God describes that, you see there, let deacons be the husband of one wife. We talked about that last time, ruling their children and their own house as well. Now, the terminology here, the terminology that describes the husband of one wife is the same terminology from what we talked about with the elders. And the implication, a couple of ways you might have looked at this. One woman, man could mean, he has to be married. He has to be married to only one woman in his entire life. He has to have one scriptural marriage. We typically say probably the most reasonable is probably accurate in the sense, what is the most likely description here? That a man has been married to one person. And, if I said, this man must be married to only one person, probably most of us would kind of collect the idea that they hadn't been divorced or widowed. They'd only ever been married to one person. So that would seem to be the most likely candidate for the qualification there. We talked about this last time. Certainly, if you got any comments about that, throw them out there. Love to hear what they say. But I want to pick up to this next point here as we're talking about these things, where it talks about that they need a people who are ruling their own children and their own houses well. Kind of a neat or important idea here. Certainly, it's something that everybody who has children needs to think about. When we consider this language, first of all, I'm going to grab some, throw our PowerPoint up for just a second so we have something to think about here. The word for ruling is this word that implies the idea of standing before somebody. In other words, like their rank or, you're right in front of them, you're standing up. And I would say to stand before somebody as being the symbol of it. So I kind of like that idea. I think it's kind of neat to say that they are people who are in front of their homes as good leaders. They're good examples of leadership. They're doing the things that they need to be doing that demonstrate to their own families what it is to be faithful. I kind of find it interesting that some translations, instead of the word ruling, would say they're good managers of their children. And why I find that kind of interesting is the idea, too, that if the deacons are also, in a sense, managing the congregation, you can kind of get a sense where it would be expected that they could manage their own children. So if they can manage their home, they can manage their household as they're managing the children, that's going to be an important point. Stan grabs an idea here with that word prostomai, to stand before. Stan sees it as being an example. And Stan, that's what I think too. I think the idea is fundamentally to rule your house well is to be an example of all the virtues you want to be. I say that, it's kind of interesting to think about it because when the Word of God talks about the idea of elders, or even particularly Paul says this to Titus the evangelist, he says you need to be the living example of everything you teach. And I think it's a great point for a deacon to consider. They're to be a living example of all the things that they teach. Teresa makes this comment. She says, good managers, it's headship with integrity. Great point. And that concept of integrity means there's really nothing that can be drawn to a fault in that headship. Now, let's kind of pause for a second and look at the point we've always looked at and said this is something all of us need to be mindful of. All fathers in Christ are called to raise their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. They're all called to lead a household. They're all men of God are called to be the figure of virtue in their home. So let's not just say that this is a particular to the deacon. This is something all men should be aspiring to do. And deacons are accomplishing it. That's how we know that they're called to be a deacon, that they are in fact accomplishing these things. Now, kind of a couple of things we grab here and notice here is that with deacons, it doesn't mention whether or not their children need to be believing. And this kind of goes back to maybe some of our conversation in the past about whether the children of the elder needed to be faithful. Is that faithful at home, faithful to God? Well, frankly, if the qualification here is that the children have to be ruled well to be a deacon, why would it be almost the same as an elder, just worded completely differently? In other words, it kind of makes it seem like maybe that qualification for an elder is different than this one. And if so, the difference would probably be whether or not they're faithful as Christians. I would think that might be a big point. I could see, though, somebody might not agree, and I can understand that completely. But I think it's worth considering that with the deacon, there's no language that speaks to their faithfulness as Christians. It's more to the idea of that deacon's ability to rule his own household well. Stan makes this point. Stan says younger men with younger families. Now, Stan, I hope it's okay if I say I don't think that's true. I think that a deacon, there's nothing in the qualifications to speak to being a younger man. I'll say, in fact, that, and what's interesting, Stan, is I think a lot of churches do kind of look at it that way. So I certainly see why you might think that way, but I would suggest that that's not at all a part of the qualification, that there's nothing about it here that talks about them being younger. And certainly older men might well fit in that. I could see a lot of times older men, where they were good managers of their home, maybe they didn't have, their children didn't grow up to be faithful as Christians, or something like that. That might not disqualify them to be deacons. That's something that we might think about in that circumstance. That they still ruled well and they still stood before their family as a good example. Their kids just didn't follow it. That might be something. So to see that, Stan kind of, again, looks at the idea that maybe some younger men fit that. And certainly, younger men aren't excluded, like we might say is true with elders, that just the very name elder implies it's not a younger man, and younger men aren't excluded from that. Maybe that's part of Stan's point too, is that, the younger men are also called to this work as well. But as I said, it doesn't in anywhere imply the idea that they are younger men to be deacons, although it just kind of seems like a lot of times that's a tradition that we follow. But it's not the case. We can have older men as deacons, and that's just an important point that we need to consider. Stan makes a point to say maybe their children hadn't grown up enough to become members, and that could be it. That's one of many possibilities for sure about deacons, that maybe they have children that haven't grown up enough that they can be members of the congregation. That might be one of several reasons why, or just something. Again, it doesn't void their qualification here. So sure, that could be one of many things to consider there in that sense. I would say, though, that implies they have to have children. Now, here's where it gets kind of tricky, right? When I say they have to have children, I realize that a lot of times our question becomes, well, does that mean they have to have more than one child? Now, you remember, we've made the point many times that the Bible is it's a very common description that the elders of the church are a plurality of elders. We see it every time it's mentioned. It's kind of interesting, even people outside of the New Testament in later centuries, until about the second or third century, we're always talking about the overseers of the church in a plurality. There was always more than one. And so it's the point that it wasn't just, it was also something that didn't change for a long time until the great apostasy really kicked in and you started seeing a lot of these people falling and turning to just one elder. But the point was there were always a plurality of elders. Same is true of deacons. There's always only a plurality of deacons. So when we follow that pattern, we say that if you can't have a plurality of deacons, you can't have deacons. And if you can't have a plurality of elders, you can't have elders. And something I know we mentioned in our lesson this morning, if you can't have a plurality of elders, you can't have deacons. Does that make sense? In other words, when they're mentioned in the New Testament, deacons are always mentioned in conjunction with elders. So we take that part of that as well. So that's kind of a interesting consideration. But the idea is, does children in the plural mean they must have plural children? And let me say this. At first, I would say that's a pretty reasonable conclusion. But one issue is that you couldn't really talk about children in a singular sense in this conversation. So in other words, if it were to say something like ruling their own child well, we would actually infer that the qualification required them only to have one child. That would be one point. But I think there's actually something in the text that gives us a better sense of this. If we jump back and look at that one more time, in verse 12, it says, ruling their children and their own houses well. Now, what is the other plural in that sentence? What is the other plural word, the other word that is mentioned in plural in verse 12? And you could say, deacons or, husbands. That's not what I'm looking for. What is the other word that's plural there in verse 12? The other term that's used that describes multiple things, right there in verse 12, what is the other word that you see there? And when you look at that word, do you think that the implication is, Debbie's got it, now Stan's got it, Debbie Root says houses, Stan says, Stan points to deacons, Teresa says houses. Now here's the point. Ruling their children and their houses well. You guys got it. There's always kind of a delay, and I always feel bad because a delay and it pops up, and suddenly, everybody jumps in at once. But that's cool. That's actually pretty great. What I'm looking at here is the idea that, do deacons have to have more than one house? I think all of us would say, no, that's not what he's talking about. Clearly, the plural there is meant to reflect upon the multiple deacons. Well, I think that understanding that, it probably makes it likely that the children follows that same rule. And so I would suggest, Linda Van Fleet sing it, plural deacons, plural houses, that all of these kind of things line up, that probably children here isn't necessarily pointing to the requirement that they have more than one child. Now, I realize that becomes kind of a trickier question with elders. We don't have quite as clear a point to see like this, where we can put these two words side by side and say it must mean that. But I think one of the points to consider is whether or not the qualification of the deacons fits in a similar manner as qualifications of elders. That would be a question that is worth considering as well. So I think that that's a good point. So I hope that makes sense. Sometimes the nuances of words are kind of, you have to get very clear to. But, let me kind of make this point. Whenever you're kind of dividing up, parsing up the Word of God very specifically in statements like this, I know sometimes you kind of wonder, well, is it possible we're being a little too detailed in looking at these things? And the idea is that if that's thinking that way, well, one point is that when Jesus was making the case for the resurrection of the dead, he talked about God identifying himself to Moses as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Jesus makes the point that because the term used there is present tense, not past tense, that indicates that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still in a fashion alive and had a hope of resurrection. Well, that's a pretty small point to make, and yet here is the Son of God saying that that's a point we should have gathered. So I would suggest that we're okay to kind of look at words like this and try to make a point, particularly when we don't have a lot else to go on. So I think it would be accurately handling the word of truth in this if we see this concept as being revealed, that it's not about the plurality of children being the requirement. It's merely talking about the children, whether they're singular or plural. Like I said, if you don't agree, good to hear from you. Put your thoughts down. I'm always willing to listen, and I don't think it's an easy one to understand. I certainly could be wrong trying to put these things together. So if you have any other thoughts on that, sure love to hear it. Stan says, verse 4 for elders in subjection. Oh, Stan's going back to the qualifications of elders, and he's making that point that in verse 4 it talks about the children of the elders. So Linda makes an interesting comment. She says, maybe it could have said each deacon is to rule their own house. Linda, why didn't it say that? Huh? I mean, that's a good point. That really could have been one way to do it. And I wish I was a better Greek scholar to have kind of a knowledge to say, would that have been an expression they could have used? Was that something that they could have said? I mean, sometimes in the English language, we can say one thing a lot of ways, but we have a much more versatile language than a lot of the ancient languages. I don't know if we always appreciate that. We kind of, part of our brain just thinks all languages have been the same, but in times past, languages have not been very complex and they've not been very expressive. And there was times in the past where maybe, some of the ways we're able to word things, the ancients might not have been. And as I said, I wish I was a better Greek scholar for you to have a better point about that. But Linda, that's a very interesting observation. Maybe they could have said that, and why didn't they? I don't know. That's a point I would think about too. So I appreciate that. That's a good point. Got another comment here. Grant says, should household include people other than the deacon's spouse and children, like servants? And Grant, I was kind of hoping nobody'd ask. It's a good question. It's a good question because that terminology about the household is used to describe people that might not be just your children. That, in other words, we might think of Acts chapter 10 and Cornelius and his whole household being obedient to the gospel. Acts chapter 16 and the Philippian jailer and his household being obedient to the gospel. Now, the real truth of the matter is, Grant, I don't have an answer to that. I don't really know to say anything except, first and foremost, in ancient times, boy, Grant, I don't even know I have a good answer for this. I know that I would say this. In ancient times, a servant oftentimes was seen like a child of the person. So there is a sense where, if you served a man, it wouldn't be unusual to be regarded like a son for that man. That was a pretty common thing. So I might suggest in some ways, maybe there was a way that a servant might fit to that. But I would also suggest that probably most people didn't have servants, or at least servants that lived in their home like that, unless they were powerful men. Cornelius was, a man that had servants, but he was a powerful man. So that's maybe part of that point there. Teresa, I thought Teresa was going to bail me out and give us the answer, but Teresa just points to another example, Lydia and her household. And in Lydia's case, it's kind of interesting because, what was her household? Does she have children? It doesn't tell us one way or the other. So, Grant, you're right. Household could include other things. I think maybe we're best off just to see this as children, that children in a household is kind of a tied together idea. Otherwise, it kind of becomes a little too complex to understand. So again, I acknowledge that's not really a great answer. And maybe if the guy leading the class was a little better of a scholar, or put a little more time into it, you can find a better answer to that. Stan throws out Eutychus. Was Eutychus the young man that fell out of the window, Stan? I don't remember now. So there's that point. But beyond that, Lamar's going to save me. Thanks, Lamar. So Lamar says deacons cannot be double-tongued. So it seems the household would include servants, extended family, anyone else under their care or authority. Interesting point. Lamar, I think I understand what your point is there, which is interesting. That not being double-tongued would imply the idea that they have other attributes that are meant to stretch out to beyond just their immediately blood family. Is that kind of your point, Lamar? And if so, that kind of makes sense. That if there are other qualities or qualifications that extend to other people, that it wouldn't be unreasonable that this one might as well. So the idea there is that it really is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Lamar, I think that's probably the best answer I've got that I can think of. I think what you're saying there is really good. That if there are other qualifications that stretch to them, that might make sense. It might go to others. So I'll tell you what, for the sake of this study, we're going to anoint Lamar as the expert on this one because he came up with the best answer. And so further questions, I'm going to direct to Lamar McDonald. I'll give you his phone number and address after class. I'm just teasing. But thanks, Lamar. That actually is a good answer. I think that's as good as one we can get. Gregor adds one more thought to us. He says, servants and slaves seem to be synonymous. Sometimes something hard for us to understand, but seems to be normal of that time. Gregor, you're right. In fact, Gregor, the word, our Bibles a lot of times kind of avoid the word slave because we see a connotation to it. But, you know, the word in Greek, doulos, which is a little different than diakonos, doulos, slave or bond servant is how it's often translated. That's what the apostles are always calling themselves. I'm a slave for Jesus Christ. I'm a slave for the church. You know, Romans chapter 6 talks about all of us being slaves of Christ. We don't like those terms. Gregor, you're exactly right to say, you know, that's something that we're not, it's hard to understand because we have such a horrible history in regards to the concept of slavery in our country. But if we could step out of that historical context in our country and go back, we might understand that slavery oftentimes was something akin to an adoption almost. You were bringing somebody into your home that you would then take care of and be responsible for. Yeah, they would serve you, but you were also the caretaker. The Romans had a special word. What is I just forgot it. Patrio. I just forgot the word, but it meant father, you know, that basically the Roman household man was the great father, and that meant he was a father to his children, but also to his servants. And Gregor, I think that your point there really fits that nicely. Lamar clarifies, he says, yeah, that's so Lamar and I were on the right page there. He says the other qualifications should be seen by all. Verse 13 says that they will be rewarded. So Lamar, again, makes that point to say these are qualifications everybody sees. Here's an interesting point. George takes us back to Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19 and discussing here. Well, George, that's talking about Abraham, if I recall correctly. Am I right? Yeah, that's Abraham he's talking about. For I know him that he will command his children and his household after him, and they will keep the way of the Lord. So there's a neat point of a servant of God who is commanding his children and his household in a similar fashion. And I just think that's a really good point, that what we're talking about here might well fit to that. Guys, I'll be honest, I've never thought about this. This question and these comments are really interesting. I've never given them that thought. And that's just really interesting to think about that certainty. And I think it fits nicely what you've said, Lamar, and kind of pointed out here, because if, again, the point of this is to demonstrate that this is a man who has an ability to oversee things that are in his immediate care that he is entrusted to care for. And again, I don't think any of us today would fit well, kind of going back to what Gregor said, really might fit that context of a servant in a household. Maybe, you know, if you're like me, you watch Downton Abbey and, you know, you think of those servants in that household, you might think of them more like that. But I just don't think we have a servant relationship like that in our culture at all. But that would fit well for that anyway. You know, if we can ask some of our deacons from the past if they had any servants we didn't know about. But beyond that, you know, frankly, I think it's just kind of interesting. I've never thought of it. You guys have really given me some stuff to think about. I really appreciate that. That's really pretty great to kind of think of these things. Again, but the point is this. These are stewards who are demonstrating that they are trustworthy and that they can actually be trusted with the care of people. And that's what our deacons are. They're people that are trusted with the care of the saints, God's most precious commodity. So they have to have demonstrated these things. They have to have demonstrated these ideas. So I think all of that is a really important way of considering these things. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pick up and move on just for a moment. If you've got any other comments about this, like I said, you guys have really brought up some great things, and I really appreciate that. This next slide is completely blank, kind of like my mind sometimes. I don't know why I put a blank slide in there, but let me see if I can get past that. There we are. All right. So picking up here, we're going to jump on, and we're going to talk about the statement that's found here in verse 11. In verse 11, let me just grab that passage for you for a moment. Likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. Now, there's a couple of things about this passage that's interesting. For one thing, there are a couple of passages that render the word wives as deaconesses. Now, let me just say this. That actually doesn't work at all. The word literally means women, And it's only the context that people use the word wives to kind of describe this, that it's a possessive use of the word women. So it's implying it's somebody's woman, which would be somebody's wife. Now, there's always been a question about this passage to many people. I'm going to put it out there. I'd like to. I have some thoughts to put to you on it, but I want to kind of see what you think about it. Why is it that we have qualifications here for the deacons' wives, but we do not have qualifications for the elders' wives? In other words, you go back up through the passage, you go back to the conversation about elders, and there's no parenthetical statement that's kind of just sat in the middle of that that says, hey, here is the qualification for the wife of the elder. Why is it we have this point made about the wives of deacons, but we don't have a similar statement made about the wives of the elders? I think some of us might think, well, the qualification of an elder is even more stringent than that of a deacon. Now, by the way, let me kind of pause for a second while you're thinking about the answer to this question and say this. I don't know that that's always the best way to think. That, in other words, the mindset that says, well, it's harder to be an elder than a deacon, so the qualifications are harder. I think that we need to appreciate that the qualifications for a deacon are pretty strict. And I'm not sure that I would make a great case to say that the qualifications of an elder are more complicated than the qualification of a deacon. Now, you might be thinking about the idea of faithful children. That tends to be in our brain what we kind of say makes a difference between elders and deacons. But let's just apply the idea that an elder is supposed to be someone who's older, therefore their children are grown, and the expectation is they're going to be faithful. That could fit into that too. But maybe the other idea I want to say is that I think there's sometimes a thought that the work of deacons isn't as important as the work of elders. I know a lot of churches where they have elders and they don't have deacons, and they kind of feel like, well, we're scripturally organized now that we have elders. But without deacons, you're really not scripturally organized yet. Deacons are a very important part of the congregation. And so it's really important that we understand that, and we understand, I'm not sure that it necessarily follows that it's always more difficult to qualify an elder than it is to qualify a deacon. I think that's an important thing that we might want to consider. But my question to you was, why do you think that it mentions deacons' wives and not elders' wives? There's a couple of answers I think you could come up with. I've seen some of the answers people have. I have a thought that I think, at least I kind of apply to this as well. Before I throw mine out there, I wanted to see what you had to say. But I'm going to go ahead and throw you my thought here. Here, Grant's got a point. Grant says, could it be that a deacon's wife is expected to share more of that responsibility than the wife of an elder? That's a very good observation, Grant. That's actually not one I was thinking about. But certainly, a lot of times we see that very idea in the service of elders and deacons. In our congregation, our deacons' wives have done some, when we had deacons, unfortunately we don't now, but when we had deacons, our deacons' wives were extraordinary servants. They did a lot of things. I'll tell you what, the wives of our deacons helped put together a pretty fantastic curriculum for our young adults, but so did the wives of our elders. So, that might be true or it might not be true. And that's a very interesting observation, Grant. Anybody else got a comment? I'm going to go ahead and throw you my thought here. One thing I would suggest is this. I said it earlier that this is kind of parenthetical. In other words, it's kind of sat right in the middle of the context of the qualifications of the deacons. So the presumption is it applies to the deacons. But actually it doesn't say it does. I would suggest to you that it's very likely that what we're talking about here when it talks about their wives is it's talking about the wives of deacons and the wives of elders. Because as I said, it's parenthetical. It's kind of dropped in the middle there. So it doesn't necessarily fit that it has to be only the deacons' wives here. But I would suggest that one point is, since it doesn't tell us whose wives we're talking about, that it may simply be saying both of their wives, wives of elders and wives of deacons, need to achieve these things. Now, Stan's got an interesting point. Stan goes to 1 Timothy 5 and the older women qualifications. Now, Stan, what's neat about that, you're talking about the widows, right? So in 1 Timothy 5, there are qualifications given for widows. And Stan, I've never thought about that in the context of the wives of the elders. I was thinking of what Monique says in the next statement. So Stan, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Monique, though, takes us back to say, you mentioned that elders typically have grown children, older wife, and Titus 2 applies to all older women. So, Monique, that's the other answer I think we see, is that we might go over to Titus chapter 2 and see a list of characteristics for older women. Now, what's neat about that term, Monique, is that it's quite literally elders' wives. But contextually, that's not what he's talking about. But it is kind of interesting that that could be a way that it could be termed, because that's the point there. So Monique, I do see that to fit nicely. If somebody said, well, there are no qualifications for an elder's wife, at the very least, I'd say, well, certainly she has to meet the qualifications of Titus chapter 2. So that's a really good point there. Stephen Root says the following. He says an elder's wife could have the same requirements of the elder himself. Stephen, that's the other point a lot of people make. A lot of people say we really can't suggest that the elder's wife is that the concept of the partnership is so tight that the elder's wife has the same qualifications of the elders. And I think that's an interesting idea. And some people would say then that the deacon's wife isn't quite that same partnership of those works, so it's a little different. So a lot of people have made the point that you're making there, Stephen, and I think that's a really good point. That perhaps what we are to consider is that the elder's wife needs these qualifications too. One thing, Stephen, that kind of supports what you're saying is that you can imagine if somebody was standing up to be an elder and his wife, you jump back and grab some of the qualifications of an elder's wife or an elder, good behavior, hospitable, that if his wife wasn't hospitable, if his wife wasn't of good behavior, if she wasn't sober-minded, we would probably say he ought not to be the elder. We might naturally conclude he wasn't qualified if his wife didn't meet the same qualification. So, Stephen, I think that there's a powerful argument to be made, and typically that's one of the most common arguments people do make, to say that she actually fulfills the same requirements as he does. And Debbie kind of corrects that. She says, except being a husband, of course. You're right, Debbie. That's exactly right. That would be the exception to that rule. Good point, Debbie. Good point. Thank you for our Oregon audience there. You never know. So thanks for making that point, Debbie. Lamar goes on to say, hospitable for elders would seem to include qualifications for his wife. And for deacons, the wife should have the traits in verse 11 as a witness to her godly character. That's an interesting point. Kind of balancing out the idea of what could be different about the elder's wife and the deacon's wife. Again, that the elder's wife meets the same qualifications as the deacon. Boy, I'm making a mess of this. Let me slow down and say it again. The elder's wife has the same qualifications as the elder, while the deacon's wife, her qualities testify to those things. Lamar's point's very interesting. It's a very good point to consider. Stan is pointing to the elder women teaching the younger. That's Titus chapter 2 again. So Stan's kind of taking to that point that Monique took us to just a moment before. Now, Teresa reminds us that in the King James Version, it says women in like manner us. So it sounds like it could relate to both the elders and the deacons. And so actually, again, the King James Version, like I said, it doesn't, not just the King James Version, there's not one translation that tries to say, no, I better not say that. I could be wrong. But none of the translations I typically use the term the deacon's wife. It usually just says likewise their wives, because the word doesn't actually have the word deacon in it. It just says their wives. And the likewise was the same term that was used in verse 8 to talk about deacons. It's just talking about the quality characteristics. And so I think that really, my opinion is that this is talking about both the wives of elders and deacons to that end. But like I said, all these comments are good because I think we have to consider that all of them might fit nicely. So, wow, just some really great comments as we think about these things and look at these things here. So as we pull this up, let's just take a second and go through these qualifications of the wife of a deacon or the wife of an elder, as I was suggesting, or however we want to look at this. The first one we might consider here then, let me grab my note and pull it up for you, is the word reverend. By the way, we saw this terminology before when it talked about the deacons in verse 8, that they also must be reverent. Again, I think we talked about this a lot, but I will say that going back to what Monique said when she talked about Titus 2 applying, that's the term that's used to describe the older women. Older women are to be, and this is the same exact word that's used, in Titus chapter 2 and verse 3. So to Monique's point, certainly this statement qualifies or speaks to the wife of an elder as well. We would know that by necessary inference, in fact. So that's a good point. Stan says, ERV says women, not wife, wrong. So I think Stan is making a point, the ERV, I'm not sure what the ERV is actually, but the ERV says women, which is a lot of translations use that. And like I said, woman is what the word is. It's just a possessive version of that. So that's what it means to that end. So it's a good point. So the first term, reverent, important. I think when you think of the word reverent, revered, you could talk about somebody who is revered because of their character. And that might jump to what Stan had said earlier in 1 Timothy 5 about those who are widows, that they are revered by the congregation for their good works. That would be a nice fitting description of these things too. So I really like that idea of revered, being reverent. Not slanderers. Kind of a fun word here. Is that really a good point to say? A fun word? Again, when we talk about the people who have served, the women who have served as, in helping their husbands in the work of deacons, me diablos. What do you recognize in that word? What's interesting about that? Me means not. So, diablos, what would you say? What word do you see there pretty clearly? And the answer is devil, right? They're not to be devils. That would be a good point. But remember that the word devil means the accuser. So that's kind of an important idea, by the way, because that helps you to see the accuser of the brethren being taken out of his position in the book of Revelation is speaking to the idea that Satan can no longer accuse us. Debbie's got it, devilish. Don't be devilish. That might be a good way of putting it. But in this idea, it's the idea of somebody who goes around saying things about others. So it's kind of a neat point to get it. But you all picked it up. That's the same word that in our language becomes the word devil. I'd love a translation that said that they can't be devils. That would just kind of be interesting. But the point is, like I said, understand that the word Satan means, opponent, adversary, and this word devil means accuser. Kind of neat how those words are used to describe our adversary, the devil. Here's a comment from Teresa. She says, both elders and deacons' wives may have knowledge of situations that should not be repeated or discussed. They must not use that knowledge against others. That's a great point. That there is oftentimes a very sensitive characteristic to conversations that are had. And let me just kind of say that, in the time that I was a deacon, or in the time that I was an elder, or in the time that I am a preacher, I keep very little from my wife. I tend to tell, in fact, you might kind of be worried to say, you tell her everything? Yes, I do. I think that's smart and safe and important. And I need her impact, her input, her ideas. I don't think there's a good partnership without that sharing of information and ideas and thinking. So I think Teresa's point is really important, that you can see how, and it's kind of funny because think about what that is for, like, I'm picking on Wendy, so I'll go and pick on a little more, that I need to tell this to someone to get their sense of things. So I tell Wendy, but maybe Wendy then has to keep it to herself in that conversation. It's almost unfair, but she does. That's her. That's part of her work there. So you can kind of see why that might matter so much. So, it's a good point. Teresa makes a point, gossiping. Yeah, that's the danger. And Stan agrees with that. That's a good point to consider, that they have to be careful with that knowledge. So it's a really good point for us to consider. The next one we've got, they are to be temperate. Temperate, sober, circumspect. It's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of times this term is used. It's used back earlier when it talks about, if I jump back to elders, back in verse 2, and it's kind of interesting. It's talked about there that it speaks to the idea of their emotional self-control. And so it's the same term used with older women, that older women are to be, temperate. And as I said, the idea of their emotional self-control, that they're not, they don't lack self-control. I think that's just such an important idea in how it is that we behave that they have control of themselves and their emotions. There's a lot of ways that we can tell somebody doesn't have control of their emotions. Outbursts of wrath, for example, or just a lot of characteristics. Like, a lot of things come to my mind when I think of the idea of the examples of not having our emotions under control. Well, the wives of deacons and the wives of elders are to keep their emotions under control. Faithful in all things. Again, a term that's been used before to talk about the characteristics of those who are serving God, that they must be faithful in all things. But it's kind of interesting. It's just kind of a summary statement. Pisteos is that word for faith, and impas means, the totality of things, that everything that they're charged to take care of, they're faithful to take care of. It might fit to one of those ideas that they are blameless, or ideas where you just say that it's kind of a general summary to say you don't really have an accusation you can make about them. You can cover a lot of bases with that kind of qualification. It's interesting that Teresa goes on to say, in order to make wise decisions and judgments, be a good example. Have the respect and influence they need. I kind of would like to apply that back to that statement as we step back for a moment and say that's a great reason why we need to be temperate and self-controlled. Because people that have self-control are people that are respected or respectable. So I think that that's just a real important point for us to consider in these qualifications as well. So it's a really good point as we kind of wrap these things up. Whoops. I think we'll go ahead and pick up. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Kind of a reminder, we've already covered the rest of these things as we've talked about them. Here, as we've looked at these, we went back and talked about them being tested. We talked about having served well. They obtained for themselves a good standing and a great boldness in the faith, which is in Christ Jesus. Now, I just kind of want to lay it down again to say, verse 13, that there's just something really important about serving as a deacon. And I just can't stress it enough that the service of a deacon is just vital to a congregation. And so those who've served well as deacons have a good standing. And they might say that could be in the things of God or among the brethren, and great boldness in the faith. I'm always careful to say that specifically in Acts chapter 6, the men that are mentioned there, they're never actually called deacons, and their qualifications are different, but we kind of look at them like they're, kind of like deacons, right? Well, to that end, I think it's a great point to consider. How did people look at Stephen or Philip, who later served as an evangelist in a church? It's kind of important to understand that, we can see verse 13 in somebody like Stephen or somebody like Philip, somebody who has great respect, and they're very bold in their faith. They're not timid. They don't hold back, but they're people that are that their faith is out there and it's seen. Their conduct is righteous and it's seen. And to serve well in the capacity of a servant of the church like this is to have a good, confident standing in the spiritual things of God. It's not, and Lamar kind of said earlier, kind of like a reward. And it's kind of interesting, Lamar. I look at it more like it's the natural consequence of that too. But I think reward isn't a bad way of looking at this either. But what they have is, if you serve well, then you'll have a good reputation among others. You'll be well regarded, and you'll have a boldness in the faith in this kind of service. It's important to understand that this experience helps us to be stronger and more faithful. So it's a good thing to pursue. Now, that being said, we've said it before, anybody can serve the church in a generic way, not within those works of the church, but within more the service of the church. And it's important for us to always make that quality and characteristic understood, that this is something that every one of us can do. Kind of debating here. I don't know if we want to bring up the next point or not, because it's kind of an interesting thing as he goes through verses 14, 15, and 16. I tell you what, I think I'm going to go ahead and pause here, and we'll pick up verses 14, 15, and 16 next time. What I think is interesting about those passages, of course, is that they're going to be delving into the idea of why he wrote the letter. We've actually talked about that quite a bit, verse 15, because we introduced this book by saying verse 15 is our purpose of the book statement. It tells us why he wrote it. But verse 16 is really interesting. To talk about the mystery of godliness. I think I've even done sermons on just that verse because I think it is a very interesting verse. Kind of some of the language that's used there, and I want to spend a lot of time, well, relatively speaking, some time in that. So we'll kind of bring ourselves to a close here. I don't see any other comments to bring in, so we'll go ahead and kind of pack up our thoughts for the day, and then next week we're going to come back and pick up verses 14, 15, and 16, and then go into chapter 4 and talk about one of the great prophecies of the New Testament, a super important prophecy that all of us need to be aware of. It's made many times in the New Testament, and it's just an important one for us. But in the meantime, pray that you'll spend your time in the Word of God this week. If you're able to join us Wednesday night in person, our class on the book in the book of Numbers, let me check here. That's going to be Anthony's going to be covering that. And by the way, thank you, Lamar, for covering that class last Wednesday. And Anthony's going to cover it next Wednesday. And that's Numbers 27, 28, 29, and 30. And so you're going to be picking up those things, chapters 27, 28, 29, and 30. And I will see you again next Sunday. And we're so very grateful for all these fantastic comments. All of you have a great week. God bless you all.